Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Rethink Festival. This is our first digital edition, but our third edition. I'm Guido Romeo, and I'll be talking to Juha Leppanen today. He's the CEO of Nordic think tank Demos, and he will be talking to us about transformation through experimentation. I must say this is a very nice follow-up to what we talked about yesterday with Thomas Pren, because he was talking about innovation and small experiments, introducing new cultures. And this with Yua, you will see today, sort of widens the lens, zooms. It's a big zooming out, and gives us a wider perspective of what's happening beyond the current COVID crisis and the economic crisis. It looks at what we really need to do at all the climate challenge we have ahead of us. But before leaving the floor to the screen, actually, to Juha, I would like to thank the great team that is behind all of this. That's a team from POLI.design and Stefano Maffei, who designed the Rethink Festival, and of course, PwC, the sponsor supporting us and making all of this possible. Juha, the floor is yours. Please go ahead, take it away.
Buonasera, and many thanks, Guido, for the introductions. Very happy to be here, and greetings from Helsinki, which is preparing for the second biggest festival of the year, which is the Midsummers, starting tomorrow, essentially when it's light all the time and the sun never sets. So it's a very nice time to be here and have to talk with you. Although, to be honest, I would much prefer to be in Milan and Italy. So hopefully some other year that will happen. Although there is a certain Eurovision vibe in this presentation as well. So the topic today is transformation through experimentation. And before I go a bit deeper in that topic, let me introduce myself a bit more comprehensively. I run an organization called Demos Helsinki, which is a think tank. Our mission is to ensure that societal transformation is both fair and sustainable, and every individual and community is able to participate and shape the future as well. We're around 50 people, Helsinki and Paris, and we are running three types of operations: consultancy, essentially to ensure that there is action, concrete things happening, not just talk. There's research, because of course we need to have the research and evidence base in every work we do. An Untitled community, which is responsible for reimagination, creating radical synthesis through new ideas. We've been here for the past 15 years, and increasingly we see that there is an imperative to think of societal change through a very comprehensive lens. What we've done here today with the Polimi team is essentially structure a presentation in two. Part one on societal transformation and what does it necessitate, reimagination and agency. And then a part two in which we'll go a bit further into the methodology through a case study of experimentation in the context of the government here in Finland. So this is how it works, and in between we have time for questions and in the end as well. Let me start by the apparent, which is the COVID-19 crisis. At least personally, how I see the framing of the crisis, which has of course been a tragic crisis globally and something hopefully we wouldn't be experiencing in the future. Yet at the same time, I think we should think of COVID-19 as a practice round for our societies. In the 21st century, COVID-19 will not be the last crisis that we'll be facing. COVID has been a particularly fast crisis in regard to the impact, but also in regards to the responses. We also have much slower crises, such as the climate change and multiple other ones. So right now, the right question to ask is how can we as societies find ways through which we're able to tackle multiple different crises, yet at the same time leading societal transformation, not just reacting to it. So this is where we are today, and this is what we should achieve. So on a personal note, what we should focus on is the discussion has been much more on the side of resilience and bouncing back to reacting in a way through which we can bounce back to the societies where we were. Yet at the same time, when we take into account not just COVID-19 crisis, but also the climate crisis, we should much more focus on reimagination, bouncing to the future instead of only focusing on the past. So the tension in between and the focus on reimagination, which is the first emphasis of the talk. Jeff Malkin, who's a professor at the UCL, has been writing about reimagination recently, and I would strongly emphasize everyone to take a look into his work. And why is that? Why do we need to focus on reimagination? Because even with COVID-19, there are two fundamental drivers changing and shaping our way of life fundamentally during this century. Climate change and digitalization. They haven't disappeared. I would say instead, their impact will be even more significant going forward. Yet at the same time, we are living in societies that are very much based on the social contract of the 20th century, essentially a contract in between private companies, state, people, each of us having a particular role to play, transactions in between, and societal promise of what can you achieve when you are playing your role within this social contract. We've been doing much work on this in a sense of trying to explore which alternatives there would be between individual contracts, but also for individual subjects in this contract as well. So this is something that most likely we will see and need to change in a way or another. Already now, we see this social contract creaking. We see people saying that living in a democracy is less essential. We see younger generations saying that the future will not be as good as the past. We see challenges that essentially force us to face some of the fundamentals in our societies. And this decade will be a fundamental decade, essentially in terms of setting the direction. How does the next social contract look like? Which are the decisions we need to make in order for us to be successful as societies? In regards to platforms, in regards to global governance, in regards to universalism, which could be one way going forward from here, consumption work, and multiple other topics. So this is where we are, and by 2035, our societies, our way of life has to look very, very different. So that's the fundamental due to the climate change, due to a variety of other drivers that we're facing. Yet still, we are not there yet. Right now, of course, I'm sure many of you know this very, very well. I would say we are in the interregnum, in the moment of time in which the old has died, but the new has not yet been given birth to. So we're in a moment of time in which societal tensions are constant and explicit around us, yet we don't quite know what to do and where to go from here. This is the moment of time, and I'm sure this is something that at least implicitly many of us recognize. We've already seen many of the backlashes. We've seen people react towards the incapability of our societies drive the change. We've seen people to say no to some of the measures that try to take a bit further and more progressive stances in regards to, for instance, policies on climate change. We're seeing different demonstrations, different movements reacting to the interregnum. Yet at the same time, the last promise of technology solving our biggest challenges was not quite true. It's not about technology. It's not about innovation. All those play their role, but it's much, much more fundamental than that. It is about governance. In 1992, Bill Clinton said that it's about the economy. Whenever we're able to get the wheels of economy rolling, we're able to solve our challenges. This is not quite the case. If you look at the discussions with COVID, with the responses of governments on COVID, with the climate change, with digital tech platforms, it's much, much more fundamental. It is essentially about how we diffuse power, which institutional mechanisms we set in our societies. How do we move forward collectively based on the decisions we make as a democracy? So essentially, it is about governance, and that should be the focus of much, much more of our discussions. The challenge is that for the past 200 years, the focus on governance has been about stability. I'm not saying that we should get rid of stability. It is very, very important. But now, due to climate change, due to the drivers and challenges we're facing in the 21st century, we need to think of governance much more from the frame of governance driving societal transformation. The challenge here is that as the past 200 years of governance focusing on stability was based in theories and texts, a lot of authors and thinkers of political philosophy, we currently need to do much more in order to converge the thinking behind societal transformation and create solutions for governance that actually make it happen. So this is where we are. And what we currently need is, like I said, agency, and more specifically, we need governments capable of driving societal transformation, not just focusing on stability, even though it's important, but at the same time, pushing forward with transformation in a manner which gains trust and legitimacy from the people. This is the work we've been doing on the topic. So if we look at governments from a more traditional perspective, we see three different layers of challenges. We see governments focusing on siloed structures in terms of planning and execution. We don't see governments utilizing all of the power of digital networks, for instance. We see policy approaches that are fragmented and not cohesive enough, for instance, on climate policies. We see low tolerance for failures, low tolerance for reimagination or experimentation in regards to new policies. So governments, in a traditional sense, are a bit linear and incapable always of pushing forward with transformation. So from the work that we've been doing at Demos, we've been saying that you should do essentially three types of changes. You should focus on creating mechanisms that enable unbounded government, essentially government that works also between the silos together collectively in regards to not focusing on individual ministerial guidelines, but actually pushing forward as a comprehensive whole. We need governments capable of pushing for visions, capable of communicating, formulating visions that go more long-term than just a specific electoral term. And then thirdly, we need governments capable of continuously learning, experimenting, learning from failures, pushing forward with new policies and iterating from there. So these three changes, essentially formulating together the core of the next era government that is capable of not just reacting to societal challenges, but also pushing forward with societal transformation. So I'll leave this here, and then after a little bit of a break, we'll go deeper into the continuously learning and experimental governance as a mechanism that actually and more concretely enables reimagination towards future of societies. Guido, you can take over from here.
Thank you. I very much like this first part of your presentation. I think it's very clear, and it really brings on a larger view of what we're going through. And I see that some questions are coming up on my screen. But one thing I wanted to ask you is really where, I mean, you gave a very global perspective, but the question there that begs to be asked is really, well, what about Europe, and how do we fare in all of this? Because Finland is very progressive. I keep missing actually your Midsummer Festival in Helsinki. That's something I really have to come to, but I've been over there several times, and your governance model is great. Europe in this sense is very diverse. The question there then for you is, as a European Union, as 27 countries, how do you see us as in a favorable position, or are we more challenged than others?
That's a very, very good question, and you're of course very welcome to join the Midsummer festivities in years to come, Guido. I would say that the fact that, so if we take a look for the past 10 to 20 years, Europe has been quite challenged, and I would very few would argue that the agency of Europe in terms of shaping the digitalization of our societies has not been as perhaps successful as it should have been. But that has been a perspective very much from the economic development side of the events, which again is very, very important. But the fact that we're now looking at a phase in which we need to develop modes and approaches on governance, I think gives a bit of a better position also for Europe. Europe has been the place from which a lot of the political philosophy, innovations and ideas in regards to governance in the past phases have emerged from. I don't think there's any reason why that couldn't happen again. But what we need to do as Europe is to really start to focus on the fact that, for instance, if we push forward with long-term societal changes, such as the ones required by the climate change, that essentially requires us also to rethink models for democracy and deliberation. I think we're very well placed as a Europe to do that, because there is that still inherent idea of societal trust, participation, legitimacy of government in place. But it requires much, much more radical experimentation within Europe to be able to achieve that. A concrete example of this is a paper we put out on smart cities 2 weeks ago, essentially documenting the model of the Chinese development on smart cities, but also the American, the private sector driven, Silicon Valley driven approach, essentially arguing for a European model, which is partially inspired by the work done by Francesca Pia in Barcelona, but also from the Nordic experiences in regards to creating a governance model, which at the same time is able to practically steer towards the society we want to achieve, yet at the same time it's dispersed in terms of agency. And I think that's a very, very European idea. And I think those type of approaches we should explore and experiment with much, much more than we have in the past decades.
Thank you for quoting Francesca Bria. She's an Italian who has done great things both in London with Nesta and in Barcelona. And I very much like her take on data sovereignty. A new role also for the public administrator that is not an owner, but it's an intermediary of different sectors. Among the questions I have coming up here, one is about sort of brings us down to the ground and says, what are the most radical challenges that contemporary society has to face within the next year? So don't talk about the big horizon, the big perspective, but tell me that in the next 12 months or in the next 3 years, what is waiting for us? So I guess.
Yeah, I think one way to answer this would be in the context of COVID, which will dominate the debate for the next 1 to 3 years for sure, and the economic crisis in parallel to COVID. And I think one particular item we need to now start to paying attention to much, much more is how does the income streams towards the public sector actually look like? We've been now looking at the expenditures. We've seen public sectors not just designing markets, but really, really making significant interventions in regards to how our markets and societies look like. But we haven't touched upon the really big question, which is how will we fund for that? And I think right now there's still a predominant narrative that well, we see countries and nations in debt, and we will see austerity mechanisms being put in place in the next 3 years or so. But I'm not quite sure. If we look historically in regards to societal crisis, governments always have stepped up as they have to do, because there is that mandate and there is that necessity to react and push forward. And I would expect that the big discussion that we'll be facing now is how the society now reacts to governments having a much, much larger role in our societies. So that's one take, but of course, there are many, many other ways of framing the question and answering it.
I guess that's an interesting point, a very relevant point, because of course we're all looking into walking into a recession of different degrees among European countries, but it will all be severely hit, I guess, in the next 12 months. But what has been going on with the economy, also, this must be an Italian. Our listeners saying, vision-driven government is a fantastic dream seen from Italy. Could you give an example of what a vision-driven government is?
Sure. Before I go there on the previous question, still, I think historic context in terms of which mechanisms we put in place when a crisis crashes in our societies is always useful. During the Napoleonic Wars, we put in place income taxes. After the Second World War, Bretton Woods system was created. So there's always a continuation and a reaction. And the question behind is what type of a thinking, what type of alignment in terms of alliances is in place to essentially enable those new structures to emerge. In regards to the examples of vision-driven government, I think a contemporary thinker, Mariana Mazzucato, is a good person to lean towards in regards to this, because what Mariana does, she essentially illustrates that it doesn't have to be huge visions all the time. It doesn't have to be a vision of a Europe or the EU. It can also be a more specific vision in regards to economic development, in regards to a mission, such as the moonshot. So I think from her work, you can start to go a bit deeper into which type of missions and visions should we have as societies. I think right now we're in a moment of time in which many politicians are very much or a bit afraid of communicating a vision, as we see governments incapable of implementing even a bit more incremental reforms. And this is exactly the point about renewing governance mechanisms. So we need to be able to also provide toolkits for politicians in order for politicians to actually start to formulate visions that could be inspiring and thus start leading societal change. I keep citing Italians.
I was about to say, you keep citing Italian women researchers. This is fantastic, but we'll see what you come up with next. Last question, I guess, is about strategies to make governments capable of continuous learning. And this goes back to the work we have to do, a little bit of what you were saying right now, because there's not probably the political the vision capability yet in our political class.
Right. So this would be a very much of a topic of the part 2 of the presentation. So I could explore it there. But before that, I very much agree with what you said. And I do think that it is the role of an expert or a community of experts or academia to provide politicians with those capabilities. It's not just something we can put out there for politicians. It's also our responsibility. And in many ways, I already see it happen. Our government program currently states carbon neutrality for 2035. We know very well that we need to be able to formulate solutions and approaches that can actually make that happen. I would not say that's the responsibility only of a politician. It is also responsibility of every one of us.
We have still a little bit more than 15 minutes, so maybe we should get on with your part 2 and leave some time for question that.
Yes, would love to. I'll try to answer the question on how to enable a government to learn. So part 2, which is titled Reimagining Society through Experimentation, is much more of a case study in regards to the work we've done here in Finland with the Prime Minister's office, but work that we are actually doing around the world with governments and with some other organizations as well. So one big part, a chunk of our work is on governance innovation, essentially enabling governments to work better in order to achieve that future that we've been talking about, tackling climate change, being able to proactively lead way through societal transformations. It's a work that we've been doing around the world. It is very much of something that you need to keep doing globally in order to learn, in order to experience, in order to keep sharing some of the best practices with. In regards to experimentation, which is now the case study here, for us, essentially, policy experimentation is an approach to fundamentally reimagine our societies by experimenting with new transformational policies with people. So you need to do that together. And it's a bit different framing than the framing, for instance, from the design sciences or from the behavioral sciences. Essentially, what we've done in our stream of work is a combination of a methodology from quantitative and qualitative in order to get the best of experimentation in terms of having a solid evidence-based and capability of learning, but also the more design-driven capabilities of reimagination and exploration. So the important note, of course, is that experimentation is nothing new. We've seen it. We've also seen it in the context of governments. But what is new is that the societal role keeps constantly evolving. And now what we've seen in the past years is experimentation that is not driving the evidence of a specific policy as such, but it's much more of a framework to explore policies and explore new mechanisms through which governments can engage with societies. This is a citation that is not Italian, but you've seen this many, many times. So we've seen innovators, we've seen practitioners throughout the history of pushing forward with actually experimenting instead of asking. And yet, in the space of the past years, we've seen global institutions such as OECD putting out a message for experimentation in the public sector, saying that the existing status quo will not be sufficient. We need to explore something new. We need to go forward from here. And this is exactly what is our work on experimentation about as well. So essentially, how can we provide a way through which a government is capable of both imagining new policies, but doing it in a systemic way? It has to be very, very structured if we're looking at governments, because of course, there's a very strong sense of responsibility in that context. So the case I want to go a bit deeper into here is the case of policy experimentation in the context of Finland. We started to work with the Finnish government back in 2014. And the end result of that was then an experimentation program that was put in the government program of 2015. So essentially, the government program is the highest political agenda in the context of Finland, which is a piece of paper negotiated with the coalition government that then guides the way forward for the governmental term, which is 4 years. And this is what happened here as well. The background to the work on policy experimentation in Finland was a work on steering. How can we essentially create a better working government as a comprehensive whole? The project was called OHRA. It was led by the current then state secretary and given forward to the current then prime minister, Alexander Stubb. So essentially a mechanism through which a government can work more strategically, combining the agenda setting function, the action and implementation function, and the learning how function. So this is where we came into the picture. So there was already a political demand for providing new approaches on governance in place. The core motives for creating an experimental state, essentially there was a recognition that the current governance does not provide sufficient solutions to the challenges we're facing. We need to create new mechanisms for trust and legitimacy, to new mechanisms to tackle the fact that we're facing increasingly scarce resources, digitalization as an agenda, and of course, global challenges and big problems. So this was the motivational piece that was created back in 2014 in regards to the motives behind what the government then ordered us to help them out with. So the question that the Prime Minister's office posed was essentially twofold. Could experimental methods, design thinking, and behavioral insights be utilized in the Finnish policymaking? And if so, what would be the best way to incorporate them with policy design process? What happened, we won the tender. Aalto University was our partner on the tender, and there was another partner as well. We went through the current then best practices globally. We initiated a process of co-creation together with leading Finnish civil servants, essentially utilizing both civil servants, politicians, experts, academia in Finland and around the world to formulate a model that could fit the context and answer the challenges that the government was facing. And then we did quite a bit of a legwork in terms of validation politically in regards to whether what we had formulated as an expert process would actually make sense. So this is a very rough outline of the model that we suggested as a process. So essentially, the idea is that the first phase, which is on blue here, is a more qualitative phase. So essentially ensuring that there is enough participation in regards to definition of the problem, but also exploration of potential approaches moving forward. And then the phase two, which is more quantitative, first a contextual experiment, which is essentially to see whether what we know that could work, for instance, in Milan would work in Turku here in Finland. And then a more quantitative experiment that would help us out in regards to actually getting evidence that is required for the government to make decisions on a particular policy. So this was a rough outline. We implemented 3 of the experiments ourselves, roughly in regards to this outline, but each ministry then formulated their process as they saw fit in regards to the policy in question. The interesting thing here is that when we were suggesting the process, it was essentially a double diamond type of an approach, but as we saw that being a bit of a challenging for civil servants to actually feel comfortable with, we just reduced it into a very linear approach that fits the current cultural alignment within the government in regards to policy design. What we did additionally is we connected the experimentation program. So we suggested that that could be incorporated in the government program. So essentially, we got the political agenda from the government program, and experimentational program was a way of implementation, changing the how government implements the political agenda. That helped because we got both structure, but also process for assessment and evaluation. What we did then additionally was a creation of what we called infrastructure for experimentation. This was done by the Prime Minister's office, so we were only partially involved. But essentially, for instance, what we saw very, very important was an introduction of a national code of conduct. Because if you do work with policy experimentation, policies such as social policies, employment policies, you would necessitate a code of conduct to ensure that there is an amount of ethical awareness whenever that work is being implemented. So the infrastructure for experimentation, as it was then conceived during the last government term, incorporated from code of conduct to experimentation legislation, networks, more cultural support mechanisms, digital platforms. So a variety of different things, because in the end, what was titled in the government program was a cultural change towards experimentation in the context of the Finnish government. And if in order to push forward with cultural change, we all know that that necessitates a very wide portfolio of interventions, approaches, and projects that help to achieve that. In the end, what we saw was an experimentation program in the government program, under which we had 27 policy experiments that the government then ran back between 2015 to 2019. Essentially then, ministry is getting policy recommendations from each of the experiments, but also from the experimentation program as a whole. Experiments included, for instance, experiments on learning, on employability, which employability interventions make most sense in specific circumstances. Experiments on the impact of arts and culture on health services in regards to whether you get more positive subjective well-being impacts if you incorporate arts when you provide health services. So the variety of experiments was quite significant. Like said, for us, and I would say that then became partially true in the case with Finland as well, is to think of policy experimentation not as a mechanism only to learn and iterate, to test gradually, but also as a mechanism to reimagine and experiment with new transformational policies. And this is something I've come much more to emphasize in the past years, due to the fact that as we talk much more about climate change, changing work lives with COVID, there is a stronger necessity to not just think how we fill a puzzle by experimenting with each different pieces, to actually start drawing completely new paintings at the same time. And in its best, experimentation can be a way through which politicians are able to actually trust themselves and trust the governance to be able to build and think of those visions, and trust that the government is able to experiment and hopefully implement those visions in reality in years to come. If I take a concrete example of this, that would be still the basic income experiment, the UBA experiment run by the Finnish government back from 2017 to 2019. And that experiment was part of the experimental portfolio initiated by the government in 2015. It's an experiment that has been covered a lot, and it has been challenged as well in terms of premises, and I would agree with those challenges. The initial idea from the scientific group was a two-phased experiment, phase one being more restricted and the second phase being more expanded. Phase two was never done. The government from 2015 to 2019 never wanted to continue with the UBI experiment. The interesting thing here is that what doesn't really necessarily always be apparent is that the government we had in place from 2015 to 2019 was one of the most conservative governments we've had in the past decades. And for that government to experiment with basic income, I felt was quite significant in itself, even though the goal of the experiment was to experiment with basic income and the re-regulation of social benefits in regards to employability. It still opened a discourse and a channel for us to discuss on basic income done through an experiment on a national level. And it does, at least for myself, illustrate the importance of providing politicians and decision makers with new capabilities for reimagination in our societies. So you all know the news. I'm sure it's been covered both in Italy and around the world. And then, like said, there are multiple other experiments happening around the world as well. Some of those more comprehensively focusing on social impact of the UBI, and some more specifically on employability, such as the case here in Finland. So this is what happened. So from 2017 to the end of 2018, 2-year pilot, essentially testing whether there is an employability impact with provision of social universal basic income. It was not universal, but a basic income of 560 euros a month. So this is what the basic setup looks like. And now that we've seen the results, we've seen both a negative impact on employability. So we don't see any significant impact in regards to employability. Yet at the same time, we see an impact on subjective well-being. Can be challenged as it was a fairly small group of people, and it is subjective well-being that we're talking about. But what has happened is an emergence of discussions in regards to the future of work, to the future of our societies, and whether we should rethink social policies more from the perspective of provision of distribution, such as basic income. So the discussion has emerged, and increasingly governments, communities, local municipalities are looking for mechanisms through which they can experiment on which it's not basic income for everyone the same. It is very different models depending on where you are. And this is exactly why it requires experimentation for whichever country, for whichever municipality to figure out which model would make most sense. So moving forward from here to the end is that, as said, we need both reimagination in regards to solving our challenges and enabling our institutions of societal transformation. But yet at the same time, we need agency. We need our key institutions taking agency and pushing forward and leading the transformation. It's not about enabling transformation. It is about leading the transformation. We got a new government in place in June, and we got a new prime minister in place now in December as well. And now we have a progressive government. We have a center-left government with Sanna Marin being the prime minister. She was the youngest prime minister for a while. Kurz, I believe, succumbed her now, but she's still one of very well-positioned prime ministers in terms of communicating how governments for the future should look like. And in the government program, the government made 4 pledges for citizens in regards to governance. So essentially stating out that if we want to achieve our political goals, such as carbon neutrality for 2035, we also need to renew governance. And the 4 pledges were: first one on continuous learning, experimentation, utilization of experimentation, and humbleness in regards to societal challenges and reforms. The second one on participation and interaction, recognition that we're not able to solve our societal challenges only from the top down, but we need to be able to communicate and engage with different groups of people all around the society. Third one on long-term policy making, creating more systematic loops in between the government and the parliament for us to be able to push through transformations and reforms that go beyond single governmental term. And a fourth one on knowledge-based policymaking, essentially a combination of utilization of evidence and experts in policy design processes, which is something I believe we've seen enormously with COVID-19 now hitting our societies with such a pace. First one of those is on experimentation. At least to me, it illustrates recognition of a government from the opposite aisle of the political table that you need new methods and new approaches on governance in order for a government to be able to successfully push forward with societal transformation and take agency on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so I'll get straight to the point. You answered very extensively one crucial question on basic income and its outcomes. And I'll just ask you, we have less than 2 minutes, so we'll go straight to it. On COVID-19, did governments experiment enough, in your opinion, or not? You might give a yes or no answer, but what is your feeling about that?
I think the experimentation with COVID is still to be seen, and it will be done in the context of tracing, tracking on the economic responses. I think the first wave was such a rapid and fast one that there was the principle of being precautionary was perhaps the most dominating one, and that's a good thing in itself. I think now the experimentation should be much more about now learning which responses made most sense, trying to understand those responses much more, and creating a systematic framework for experimentation in terms of tracing, tracking, and economic stimulus packages and responses in regards to which way works the best.
Yeah, that's definitely the scenario I see building up as well. I think our time is up, so I should thank you, Juha. This has been a lot of fun in spite of the tech glitches. I think it was a very interesting discussion. And so we will let you go, and not before reminding our listeners that we'll be back tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Central European time as usual. And we'll be back Saturday as well. But tomorrow the appointment is with Casey Climbs. So tune in again and tune in also before that. You can join the channel at 12:30 and start checking out the other contents. Thank you again. Thank you, Juha. I'll make it to Suomenlinna one of these years. I promise. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye.